Well, welcome everybody to our regular Wednesday night Sierra Club community conversations. We're excited tonight to have a great discussion about access to clean water with Jon Groveman from VNRC and Lyn Munno. Welcome, Jon and Lyn. So, Jon, let me pass it off to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So there's a small group. We can have an intimate conversation, but just for the people who may tune in later, more formally, my name is Jon Groveman. I'm the Water Program and Policy Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council for VNRC. VNRC is Vermont's oldest statewide environmental group. We were formed in 1960s as a result of development that was certainly impacting Vermont, and we've grown from a small group to a group that we have 4 program areas. We have the water program, climate and energy program, forest program, and what we call our sustainable communities program. We do a lot of work in the legislature. We do some legal work in the court systems, a lot of work with the Agency of Natural Resources on the variety of regulatory programs that they have. And you can check out more about VNRC on our website. Just Google VNRC. So tonight, I was told this was a general conversation about water. I know Mark knows a lot about water. I don't know how much other people know. What I thought I would do is just very briefly kind of talk about the general structure of water protection programs and laws in Vermont, and then talk about some of the hot issues that are going on right now and things that Sierra Club members may be interested in learning more about and even getting involved with and letting your voice be heard on. If there are any questions though about anything, if there's something I don't mention, or I'm not going into any depth on these issues because it would take a whole webinar to really talk about any of these issues in any sort of detail. But so that's for the question part. So I'll hit on a sort of a wide variety of issues, and then any questions that people have, we could do a deeper dive. So in Vermont, like really all states, water protection programs focus on 2 areas: surface water and groundwater. I'm not going to talk very much about groundwater tonight, but there's a whole series of protection programs in Vermont run out of the Agency of Natural Resources, and there are some federal laws that deal with groundwater. But I'm going to focus more on surface water today. The surface water programs in Vermont are primarily framed by the Federal Clean Water Act. So we have the Federal Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972, and it sets out a framework for dealing with discharges to our waters. And the main discharges are things that I'm sure Sierra Club members are all well aware of. There are large discharges from pipes coming from wastewater treatment facilities or industrial facilities. In Vermont, it's mostly wastewater treatment facilities. We don't have a lot of industrial development in Vermont. If you have one of those facilities, you need a Clean Water Act discharge permit. They're called NPDES permits. They're 5-year permits. They're very technical. And that's sort of the key feature of the Clean Water Act programs. The other issues that the Clean Water Act requires states to address have to do with stormwater and farm pollution and discharges from logging operations. And in Vermont, we have programs that implement the Clean Water Act on stormwater. We also have programs that go beyond what the Clean Water Act requires on stormwater. And we have a very funky series of laws in Vermont that deal with farm pollution and logging pollution, which if people have questions about, I'll go into. And it's always been an area of controversy in Vermont, and it remains so today. So that's kind of the Clean Water Act side of things. In addition, we have programs in Vermont to deal that aren't mandated by the federal government. One of those main programs is our Wetland Protection Program. We have a fairly robust wetland protection program that's run by the Agency of Natural Resources. It's a state-run program. There's a series of wetland rules that delineate like what wetlands are covered by the program, when do you need a permit to do work within a wetland. It has provisions to designate wetlands that are really ecologically significant for greater protection. It protects not only the wetlands, but also the buffer area around wetlands, which is a unique feature. And so that's a really important program that Vermont has. It's unique to Vermont. Another unique Vermont program is we have something we call the Rivers Program. Vermont has been a leader in there's the FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency that I'm sure everybody's heard of, that comes into play whenever there's flooding or flood events, and it protects what are known as floodways and floodplains. But in Vermont, we've started to protect river corridors, recognizing that our dynamic rivers that basically frame almost every city and town in Vermont, they move. They don't stay in one place. So we need to not just protect floodplains and floodways, we need to protect river corridors. There's a dam program in Vermont that both deals with dam safety, but also the regulation and licensing of hydroelectric facilities. There's a lakes and ponds program that's unique to Vermont that primarily deals with things like aquatic nuisances in lakes and ponds. And when people want permits to basically eradicate, something like milfoil is a great example of that. Also, if you want to encroach, if you want to put in a marina or a dock, that's a unique Vermont surface water program that's under the lakes and ponds section of what A&R does. And then lastly, Vermont has a program that is really part of the Clean Water Act that I think anyone who's involved with Sierra Club or any environmental group should really know about. It's called the Watershed Planning Program. And basically, Vermont is broken up into different watershed basins. And every 5 years, has to be a plan that identifies the high quality, really, the waters that are really pristine and in great conditions in these watersheds that need extra protection, waters that are experiencing pollution problems that need to be cleaned up, wetlands that should be protected or maybe get that special designation status I mentioned for wetlands, dams perhaps that should be removed. It's just a great opportunity, and it's a citizen-led process, and anyone can get involved with the watershed planning process. And I would urge people, if you're interested in water issues, to go on the A&R website, find out what watershed basin you're in, and you can get involved. The process is almost always ongoing because the plans, once they're approved, that it's not soon, they almost immediately need to start working on revising the plan. So that's something I wanted to mention. So that's a general, super general, 30,000 foot kind of description of surface water programs in Vermont. So what are the hot issues that we've been dealing with recently in Vermont and very recently, since we've had this COVID crisis? Well, the big hot issue really that we've been dealing with since 2015 is in 2015, Vermont revised a lot of its surface water laws dealing with wastewater, stormwater, farm pollution, logging pollution under what was called Act 64 of 2015. It's called the Vermont Clean Water Act. It was an across-the-board update to all those programs that I just mentioned, driven by the pollution problems, the severe pollution problems in Lake Champlain that, as I'm sure all of you know, is polluted by phosphorus. The federal government, under the Clean Water Act, had to intervene in the Lake Champlain cleanup and mandated that Vermont come up with a new and better plan to clean up Lake Champlain. And so Act 64 grew out of that. It's designed to both clean up Lake Champlain, but actually do a better job in protecting all of our surface waters. So there have been a variety of updates to all of the programs I just mentioned under Act 64. And VNRC and many of our partner groups have been working to comment and help shape and strengthen those regulatory programs as they get implemented through the Agency of Natural Resources. So you might have read about stormwater regulations being updated and farm pollution regulations being updated, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all been happening. The last piece of that puzzle that hadn't happened until last year was Act 64 required Vermont to actually fund these water programs. There's a recognition that you can have great regulations and great programs, and they won't mean anything if there's not money to implement them and to get the work done. So after 5 years of arguing about what a source of funding would be, and Rob Kidd was very much involved with this when he was working, focused more on water issues, and working with the treasurer, Beth Pierce, who was really instrumental in identifying how much more funding we needed. Last year, we finally settled on a series of dedicated funds for water, a surcharge on the rooms and meals tax, some money for if people don't return their soda and beer cans. That unclaimed deposit now goes for clean water. So if you want to donate to clean water, don't return your bottles, recycle them, but don't return them, and that money goes for clean water. And then there's a surcharge on the property transfer tax. So along with that money came a whole new system to distribute the money that is being set up right now. And you're going to see over the next year or two what are known as clean water service providers coming in to basically have a watershed area, receive some of this money, have a pollutant reduction target that the agency is going to give these providers in these basins, and they'll have to spend that money to clean that up. So there'll be more happening in your areas throughout the state. That's something that people should be aware of. Also, obviously, we were thrilled to have some dedicated funding, but COVID has really thrown all of this into question. The rooms and meals tax was said to be recession-proof because even in recessions, people would still go out to eat locally and maybe go on a staycation. Well, as we all know, none of us are really going anywhere at this point. So the rooms and meals tax has taken a significant hit. It's going to really calls into question what the funding cuts are going to be for these clean water programs, these clean water service providers, and this whole part of the program I just described. So one of the issues at VNRC, working with Lyn's group, Watershed United Vermont, and many other groups, we're very concerned about the health of the budget for these water programs going forward. We understand that we need money for so many programs to keep things going during this crisis, but we think it's a crucial investment to keep investing in these water programs. So that's something that we're working hard on. And you as advocates, I would encourage you to follow what's happening. Let your representative and senator know that we need to fund these water programs, even in these difficult times. We don't know what the cuts are going to be yet. We don't know if they're going to be, when they're going to happen, but we know that we're at a difficult horizon point. So that is a hot issue that, has been moving slowly since 2015 that has really become a pressure point issue now. Another issue related to Act 64 that's become a hot issue, and it's been in the news, you may have read about it, is the last regulatory requirement that the Agency of Natural Resources was supposed to implement was to require any site that has 3 acres of impervious surface or pavement that does not have a stormwater system that meets current standards needs to get a stormwater permit. And this is really important because there's a lot of sites out there that, that waters is running off them, causing serious damage to receiving waters. And it's really important to get these sites that don't have pollution controls to come into compliance with modern day stormwater laws. We fought tooth and nail with the Agency of Natural Resources to get this program to the point where they had a draft rule and a permit. And now the Agency of Natural Resources is balking at releasing it because they're worried about the economic impact on the owners of these sites that are going to have to come into compliance. Our position is that there's no reason to wait. It's a phased program anyway. The first step would be to get the site owners to start evaluating what needs to be done. And this has been a legacy pollution problem that's been going on for decades and decades and decades, and it can't be allowed. This is not a way to do economic relief to allow this pollution to occur. So we're going to be fighting when the legislature comes back at the end of August. I predict that this will be a big issue, that the Agency of Natural Resources is going to want to delay this requirement, and we're going to be, contesting that. There is also effort underfoot to change the wetland rules. I mentioned the Wetland Protection Program in Vermont is a good program, and we are concerned that there's going to be an effort to weaken the program. We're advocating along with our partners, in particular the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Law Foundation and Vermont Audubon, to go to a net gain wetland policy in Vermont. Right now we have on the books a no net loss of wetlands policy. That is not effective. We lose wetlands every year in Vermont, and we'd like to see that policy be a net gain of wetlands, and that would be accomplished through restoration of wetlands that have been impacted. And we're concerned that the Agency of Natural Resources and other groups are going to advocate to actually weaken the wetland rules. And lastly, a bill that's out there now that it's a good bill and it's really needed, and we'll see if it could get passed during COVID. It's H833. It has to do with water withdrawals from surface waters. We don't have in Vermont, believe it or not, really any regulation about withdrawing water from surface waters unless it's a giant, a diversion for a ski area, for a snowmaking operation, or if it's a diversion for like a hydroelectric operation. But ordinarily people withdraw water. It happens for industry, for farming. And the issue really came to a head with the proliferation of hemp farming over the last couple of years. We've seen a significant increase in withdrawals for streams and impacts on that. So this bill would basically set up a working group to develop a regulatory program for water withdrawals. The bill passed the House and it's in the Senate, and we're going to try to convince the Senate to move it because it's an important issue. We're in a drought right now, and we're seeing that these withdrawals are occurring right now, and with the drought conditions that we're seeing, there's even more impacts on the waters. So I think I'll stop there. That's kind of the overview and some hot issues. I'll turn it over to Lyn to talk about the role of watershed groups and some of the budget issues that she's really seeing firsthand. And then I'll look in the chat at these questions and then we can come back. Does that make sense to do it that way?
Sounds
Great.
good.
That sounds,
Great.
Sounds good. Thanks, John. And thank you, Rob, and everyone at the Sierra Club for hosting us. So yeah, we'll kind of shift a little from thinking at that statewide level more to what's happening at the community-based level, the watershed level, and then how those things kind of relate, obviously. So yeah, my name is Lyn Munno, and I'm the director of Watersheds United Vermont. We call ourselves WUV. And WUV is an association of community-based watershed groups across the state. And our mission is to empower these community-based groups to protect and restore Vermont's waters. And we really focus on kind of three main areas to do that. The first is to provide training, resources, and information to watershed groups. The second is to foster collaboration among watershed groups, and then also between watershed groups and partner organizations. And then the third is to act as a representative or a voice for watershed groups at the state level. And so that's often when I work with John at VNRC, is through that more statewide advocacy and policy work. And I heard that John gave a little bit of a history for VNRC. I'll just kind of briefly say that Watersheds United Vermont is a much newer organization and actually kind of sprung out of sort of post-tropical storm Irene, when watershed groups who had been doing work for decades in their own communities started communicating more across watersheds as sort of planning post-Irene was happening, and realized that groups were doing really similar work in different parts of the state and often hadn't ever met each other or coordinated or collaborated together. So several watershed organizations and some partner groups, and with some support from the state DEC, kind of got together to start brainstorming and a more of a networking organization who could help bring groups together to sort of share information on best practices and talk through common challenges, and really kind of try to leverage together, the efforts that were happening at the community level. So, what are watershed groups? Many of you maybe have worked with watershed groups before, but I don't want to make that assumption. So I'll just kind of give a little brief overview. And so watershed groups are community-based organizations that work with individuals and communities in their local watersheds on water quality and watershed health. And some groups tend to focus more on a specific aspect of watershed protection or restoration, and some really the larger organizations. So some, I should say, are all volunteer, and many are staffed organizations, and those staffed organizations tend to have the ability to work on more of a full suite of watershed protection and restoration strategies. And that may include monitoring and assessing the health of waters, and also many groups plant trees and shrubs along our river and stream banks. Groups work to manage projects to implement stormwater runoff projects. John was talking about the 3-acre projects, but there's many stormwater projects that are happening on a smaller scale as well to try to slow down our waters. Groups also, some work on dam removals and also culvert retrofits and replacements in order to improve fish passage and also other aquatic organisms. And many groups also engage, or I should say all groups really engage with their communities, with school groups, with businesses, with other community members around education, around water quality and watershed health. I should also mention, this might be a way that some of you either have or could in the future get engaged with watershed groups, is that every September, many of our watershed groups host river cleanups. It's River Cleanup Month is September. Waters tend to be low and warmer and safer at that time, and it's less destructive to the river banks. So unlike Green Up Day, which tends to happen in the spring, river cleanups tend to happen in the fall, and it's a great opportunity to get folks in the river cleaning up trash. And so hoping that will still happen this fall. So a few groups, I'm not sure, and this can come up in the chat, where folks are from. Because these groups spring out of community interest, there isn't necessarily a group in every sub-watershed, but some groups are, just to name a few, are say Friends of the Winooski River, Friends of the Mad River, the White River Partnership, Lewis Creek Association, the Memphremagog Watershed Association, Missisquoi River Basin Association. So there are a number of these groups across the state, and we also work really closely with conservation districts who are often engaged in kind of similar types of projects as well. And so I thought I would just talk a little bit about kind of what's happening right now. Obviously, COVID-19 has kind of upended everything for most of us this spring, and water quality and watershed projects are no different. It was particularly challenging for groups that the pandemic hit in March, which is kind of the big gearing up time for when groups are ready to launch into the field season. And so much of the planning work happens over the winter, much of the grant writing, planning, project preparation work, and then by early April, groups are ready to go. And so as with, I'm sure many other folks have experienced, it was kind of a roller coaster in March and early April, even figuring out what groups would safely be able to do in terms of field work this spring and summer. So thought I would just share two different examples. One where I feel like kind of after some stresses, kind of a positive turn ended up coming for groups to be able to get work done. And then the second is kind of more of a continued challenge in terms of funding budget cuts, as Jon mentioned. So the first is to talk about tree planting projects. And so again, as March came and the pandemic hit, groups had already ordered their trees. They had their sites all lined up with their landowners. They were really ready to go with projects. And then there was both a temporary funding freeze for many state-funded projects, as well as concerns over sort of COVID logistics in planting, particularly because groups rely on volunteers in the community to do planting. It's often school groups or businesses or just interested volunteers who come out and help with the labor for the planting. But groups were able to, through conversation and through their own internal work, were able to be resourceful and work with partner organizations, including the Intervale Conservation Nursery, Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, Northwood Stewardship Center, some of these groups that have planting crews. So not only our staff organizations also are able to, they themselves do some of the planting, but able to work with these partners who had COVID protocols kind of quickly put into place to safely plant trees. And obviously planting trees in and of itself is a fairly COVID safe activity outside, can socially distance. It only takes one person to get a tree in the ground. They're very small. And so I think overall watershed groups, I don't have the official number, but it was over 12,000 trees that groups were able to plant. And that doesn't include the numbers from conservation districts. And I know they planted thousands of trees as well. So, and that's with support of the Department of Environmental Conservation. They have what they call a woody buffer block grant. And then through a private company called Pure Projet that also funds tree planting in Vermont. And then some groups have other sources of funding through U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other partners as well. So that was our good positive success. The challenge came, sorry, I'm seeing the chat pop up, but Rob, you want us to wait to answer questions, I'm assuming. Okay. So the challenge was really around the water quality monitoring, and many watershed organizations actually started over citizens' concerns around the health of the waters in their area. Not all, but many started as groups that were really interested in assessing the water quality in their areas. And so watershed groups have been monitoring water quality for decades in many cases, and have done so often through the partnership of the Department of Environmental Conservation. They have a program known as the La Rosa Partnership Program, which was actually officially started kind of in the early 2000s. And that provides grant support for groups specifically for the cost of the samples. So groups often take their water quality monitoring samples to the state lab. That support, which really mostly there's some separate organizational support money, very minimal, but the majority of the money is really for the lab work. But that funding then allows groups to leverage those dollars to reach out to their communities and private donors to continue to support their program. Again, this was another program that came up with some questions around COVID safety, but groups were feeling like they would be able to monitor the water quality safely, given that it's usually just one individual volunteer per site anyway. And so groups were really disappointed when we learned that the Department of Environmental Conservation canceled the La Rosa Partnership Program this year entirely. with no funding to support water quality monitoring. And I think that, you know, the concerns are sort of, there's many aspects. One is that one of the main programs that groups do is monitor the E. coli, you know, as a bacterial indicator for the health of streams for swimming, particularly around swimming holes and areas that have been known, either areas that have been known to have high E. coli in the past, swimming areas, or you know, areas that are particularly used for recreation. And I think I have, well, I guess this is an overall number that groups, I think it's 470 different sites that groups generally monitor. So it's pretty significant. And I don't know if others have noticed, this is obviously anecdotal and not data driven, but it feels like more Vermonters and outsiders, outside visitors as well, have been recreating in our rivers and streams. So it feels particularly important that we have that water quality monitoring data on the E. coli. And while the Department of Environmental Conservation does conduct some targeted monitoring, it is not specifically targeted to E. coli. It's mostly some lake sites that they monitor. And as John was talking about the tactical basin planning, they are able to monitor some sites that are sort of key in that tactical basin planning as it comes up. But most of the sites, I think it is more than 50% of the sites that are monitored for water quality are through this La Rosa volunteer monitoring program. And another concern, as John was saying, the state has made considerable investments in clean water through Act 64 and now upcoming with Act 76. And much of the way that we're able to tell whether clean water projects are successful, for example, if we're thinking about reducing phosphorus, is to do monitoring both before and after a clean water project has been implemented. So say a stormwater project. I know many groups were disappointed that they either had put in a project last year and were hoping to do the post implementation data monitoring this summer, or a project is going in this summer or next summer, and they were hoping to do the pre-monitoring data work. So, and then also, you know, water quality monitoring is also just important to understand trends over time. It may be that we don't know that there's an issue developing until we monitor. And lastly, you know, any of you who live in an area where there is a watershed group doing monitoring, I highly recommend getting involved in water quality monitoring in the future. It's a way that people get out on the river and have their eyes and ears kind of tuned to what's happening. So not only are you getting the data from the lab, but both the staff and the volunteers are able to kind of assess whether they see any issues or problems that are happening on the river. And so this is something that we hope, you know, for right now, a few groups have kind of salvaged a few water quality monitoring sites for the summer, but most are not able to do the work without the support of the La Rosa program lab samples. And so we're kind of turning our attention now to thinking about next year, and groups are really eager and willing, and we have talked with the state, so looking forward to engaging with the state as they hopefully revamp the La Rosa water quality monitoring program to be able to, you know, be robust next summer. Because if we want to think about access to clean water, we need to know what's happening in our rivers and streams. So that's something that we'll really focus on through this next year, is making sure that that program is put back into place. And just to give a little context financially, it's a roughly around around $85,000 for the program. So it's not a significant investment from the state in the overall water budget, but it does have a big impact in our communities. And I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So I'll kind of end it to say that, you know, groups are engaged. It's encouraging to see the amount of work that is still happening. You know, everything from sort of prioritizing sites to developing projects and reaching out to landowners and implementing projects, and then monitoring projects once they're in. Those are the things that as we start talking, and Jon and VNRC looking at issues of the budget, wanting to make sure that that work can continue into the future.
Great, thanks so much. That's a terrific overview, both from Jon and from Lyn. So thanks so much. And I want to give special credit to Scott, who is mailing in his ballot right now. So everybody vote. We have a few people who have submitted some questions. I'm not sure. I see Rebecca submitted the first one, and Rebecca, I'm not clear on what this means, so maybe you could explain, or somebody already knows, but you've asked about the Green Amendment and how that might relate to discharges. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. So you're not familiar that that's on the books happening as we speak, with Maya Van Rossum and the Delaware River Keepers Group. What it's about is giving teeth to our Constitution and a Bill of Rights, so that things like fracking and discharging and development don't affect our water. So that's all. It
Okay.
must be an outside question that can't be answered here unless somebody else knows something.
Well,
about
it sounds like it relates to the federal Clean Water Act as opposed to specific. It's not in the Vermont State House if it's about.
Well, it's
But
not
Jon,
there
do you
yet.
have a sense of that?
They're working on the state first.
Oh, okay, Jon. If anybody knows about this, it better be Jon.
Yeah, I think I went to a conference last summer when you could do those type of things. It was a national coalition of environmental legislators conference, and I was talking about some of the toxic issues that we're working on at that conference. The keynote speaker was a person that was talking about this constitutional provision that existed in Pennsylvania.
Right.
They were trying to, and the woman wrote a book on the benefits of basically having a constitutional amendment to be a backstop against some of the real environmental degradation. Fracking is the big issue that they've seen, obviously, in Pennsylvania, and they were talking in upstate New York, and so it's something that they were encouraging legislators to pursue. And it's an interesting question. It's an interesting book. You can check it out. An advocacy for that approach that would be basically wouldn't supplant all the programs that we have, but it should be a backstop, sort of a public trust type of provision for all natural resources.
Yep. Thank you.
Interesting. Well, next, I think we've got a question from Mark Nelson. Mark, do you want to go? You've asked a question about wetlands.
Yeah, it's just a quick question for Jon. And Jon, I have been following, the work that they're trying to weaken the wetland rules, but what's the opportunity for individuals to speak out against weakening the wetland rules and to support the idea of net gain for wetlands? Is there a committee that people can write to? I know there's no bills or anything out there, but if folks on this call and other folks would want to take action to try to work against weakening the wetland rules, what can they do?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. So there is a committee. There's they call it a Stakeholder Committee that A&R has been convening for 4 years now, believe it or not. The first meeting was in Election Day 2016, on that fateful day, and the committee's still meeting now, but they're picking up some steam, believe it or not. And the committee is probably going to reconvene in September. And what I could do is, Mark, I could send it to Rob, the net gain proposal that we put together, VNRC, CLF, TNC, and Audubon put together this proposal, so you could see it. And there's an opportunity. Anybody could let the A&R know that they support the proposal. but then you could see what we're arguing and what how we're framing it. But yeah, so you can let A&R know they're moving forward, and they say that by October they want to have a proposed rule change. And we would see what would be in it at that point.
That's great, John. Thank you. Because my concern is that there's probably lots of organizations and individuals contacting A&R saying that the wetland rules are too restrictive. So they need to hear from people who would say, no, they're not, and that they need to be strengthened even more. So
yeah,
thanks.
Absolutely.
And is it okay if we then take what you send and circulate it further?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll send you what we've worked up. Well, I'll send you what we've submitted to A&R.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll make a note right now.
Great, thanks. So go to Nancy. Hi, Nancy. Nancy Wright has asked about funding and why that got cut. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, or?
It's just thank you. It's a question for Lynn. What was the rationale for the funding to be cut for the volunteer water quality testing this spring?
Yeah, the rationale, as I understand it, is that it didn't. It wasn't a worry about the COVID-related budget challenges for the future. It was that these DEC was overwhelmed, especially given the timing, with managing small grants. So it was a grant management staffing issue at DEC that prompted the challenge. There was concern that because there was that delay, so as I had mentioned, even with the riparian buffer planting funding, there was kind of an initial freeze of DEC funds as they were just trying to even get a handle of things, kind of understandably. But by the time they put that back into place, they felt like it wasn't worthwhile. There wasn't enough data, water quality monitoring, that we'd missed, say, the first couple of samples, and therefore it wasn't worthwhile. We still think it would have been really worthwhile to get some of that data this summer. But yes, that's the issue. It's a grant management staffing issue, as I understand it.
Bad excuse. Yeah. Okay. I have a question. John, we spoke a little bit about this before we opened up the call, but water quality certification, where the state gets a chance to weigh in on all kinds of projects that get federal funding to make, and that includes often power projects, pipeline projects that go through, across the state or through many states. But if they need if there's federal money involved or a federal permit involved, they need to get state water quality certification. So they're, meeting our standards. But some people have expressed concern that our standards are currently not strong enough. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, so under the Clean Water Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act basically says if you need a federal permit under that section of the law, the states have the authority to issue a water quality certificate for the project to ensure that the project meets state water quality standards. You either need that federal permit because you're disturbing a significant amount of wetlands, or it could be in-stream work like hydroelectric facilities. Those are the two main reasons. When you're dealing with wetland disturbance, we've seen even in Vermont, do people probably recall there was a lot of focus and controversy about the Vermont Gas Pipeline from a couple of years ago. That pipeline went through enough wetlands that they needed this water quality certificate from the state, and it basically, there was really no way for advocates who really were concerned about both the energy implications of providing more gas, right, to people, fossil fuels, that seems it's going in the wrong direction, and then also the impacts to wetlands. There was no way to stop it. There were ways to basically mitigate some of the wetland impacts, but the company had enough money to meet all the requirements that the agency put on them, and they got their permit ultimately. In some states, there is a provision in state water quality standards that say for these sort of pipeline projects that you have to do an alternatives analysis. You have to basically show that there's no alternative to these large pipeline projects that could have less impact on the wetlands. And once you have that provision, there have been denials. In New York State was able to deny a project using an alternatives analysis provision. I think there's another state out there. So there's a bill in the legislature that if it wasn't for COVID, I think it probably would have passed, that would have added this alternatives analysis to our state water quality certification process. The bill just, literally it was being taken up the week that the state shut down. And I think the House Natural Resources Committee would have passed it, but we ran out of time. It's a really good bill. It's really needed. I don't know that it's possible to get anything done this year just because there's so of limited time. But I think for next year, for sure, it'll be back on the agenda. And it's got climate implications as well as water implications. It's definitely something that I think Sierra Club would be interested. And Jim Dumont is an attorney in Bristol, Vermont, who's done a lot of work on that pipeline. And that's how I think he kind of clued into this issue. He saw that there really wasn't enough really teeth in our laws to deal with these large pipelines. And so that he was really the brains behind this bill to try to change that.
We've worked with Jim many times in the past. Anybody else? Other questions out there?
I thought I would just jump in to something that was in the chat about river cleanups, because it sounds like there's some interest, and
yes.
So just a little information on, I'm hoping, it's kind of next on the, it's like the spring tree planting, summer projects, and then, oh wait, September's around the corner. So I'm actually not sure what groups are planning. There certainly are ways that people could do river cleanups safely, even COVID-wise, because you can do it. I often clean up. We actually live right on the North Branch of the Winooski River in Montpelier, and I often go out with my family group and neighbors and collect, but through the Friends of the Winooski. And so I know that the Connecticut River Conservancy, so if you're on the Connecticut side of the state, the Source to Sea cleanup, they organize through all of the states that they work in, and often connect with local watershed groups as well. And they have a website, so you could see what cleanups are actually happening this September there. And then on our website, on the Watersheds United Vermont website, we will start posting if there's public options. So again, I don't know if it will happen in its full way, but there may still be opportunities to volunteer this year during September to clean up our rivers.
Great. Fred.
I had put a chat on, I don't know if everyone received it, but it seemed to me that if September is a good time for all these watershed groups to be doing cleanups, that it might be a useful marketing tool to start calling it a blue up day to complement the green up day in the spring, because that has a real statewide presence. It has thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteers who are generally not connected to any organized groups, but it's become such a Vermont tradition, and maybe adding a protection of our waterways to that protection of our terrestrial landscape might not be a bad thing for not only WUV to do, but to bring in all sorts of environmental partners and figure out a way to hatch an annual complement to Green Up Day.
Absolutely, and I have talked to I would love, and I think I would love to see that take off. That's interesting. Originally, it was called River Green Up Month, and then we realized, especially given the algae blooms on Lake Champlain, that was not a good name, so we changed it to Clean Up Month. But I hear you on the blue up. That's a great idea. But I'd love to see something grow into bigger that complements the Green Up Day efforts. And I've actually, when I have talked with the folks who run that program before, in the hopes that we could maybe kind of combine efforts. Nothing has quite taken off yet. I'm still kind of waiting for the right momentum and motivation to get that going. If I had time, I would definitely take it on, and it's something I would definitely be interested in exploring. So if anyone has interest in figuring out how to kind of promote it more, because I think now it happens kind of at a local level, but a lot of folks in the state don't know about it. So yeah, you're right. It has the potential.
Great idea. Great idea. Nancy, since you're here, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know that you have done a ton of work on watershed awareness. Do you want to share that with the group that's here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. I was actually putting my book here to send to Lyn tomorrow. Our church, Ascension Lutheran Church in South Burlington, that I'm the pastor of, did 7 months work in the Lake Champlain watershed, and we created a manual for faith bodies to organize themselves to focus on their watersheds. So I'd be glad to, it's free for PDF download, or it can be purchased. It is, we created an interfaith version and a Christian version. So one page of the 40-odd page manual, addresses those faith groups. The rest is about Lake Champlain and how groups can grow in leadership to enjoy the waters, learn about the waters, worship next to the waters, etc. So it was part of a doctoral program that I did. So I just realized that I may not have sent that to you, and I was just going to send you the link tomorrow.
That's fantastic, and I've heard you speak a few times at the Clean Water Network meetings, and I've always been really inspired that you're doing that work. And I know I send one thing that I do is I send out a weekly update to watershed groups and partners, and I feel like I've included information from like the Sacred Waters work that you guys have done, and so yes, definitely send me that publication. I'm happy to put it on our website and share it around.
That'd be so great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Steve.
Great, you bet. Yeah, it's great work. Rob made a note in the chat here referencing James Ayler's regarding constitutional amendment, which sounds similar to the Green Amendment. But speaking of James, some of you may have seen that James has raised the issue of combined sewer overflows quite a bit, and how that, and it certainly is a huge input. I don't know how it relates percentage-wise to the pollutant loading, say in Lake Champlain or the watersheds, but is there any thought outside of coming from James about the state moving more towards funding dealing with combined sewer overflows?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult issue that has not been addressed for too many decades. And, there ironically may be, what we really need is an infrastructure bill from the federal level. We have these wastewater treatment facilities all over the country that all the pipes, the stormwater pipes and the wastewater pipes were combined. And so when you have these extreme rain events, you basically overwhelm the plant, and you do get these combined sewer overflows and some untreated wastewater discharged into whatever the receiving waters are. It's really a public health threat in terms of swimming. It doesn't, for example, in Lake Champlain, it doesn't contribute to the phosphorus load. It's not significant because, even though the events are terrible, they're not nearly as frequent as the treatment that goes on, every single day of the waters. So it's not, a Lake Champlain phosphorus issue, but it is a public health issue. There's some hope that, and there was a Digger article recently, that one of these COVID infrastructure bills will finally provide some money to fix some of these infrastructure issues and prioritize them. And Rutland would be the #1 priority. The Rutland's system is the worst system in the state. And Rutland's Public Works Director, Jeff Wenberg, would acknowledge that. And that's really what needs to be done. And we need to get serious about it. We need to lobby our federal delegation, Senator Leahy, who has a lot of influence over appropriation of money and has certainly sent a lot of money to Vermont to deal with clean water. I mean, we need money to fix these plants and redo the piping, essentially. And there's just not enough money in the state to do that.
I know it might have been 30 years ago that Burlington, not too far from the time when it issued an enormous energy conservation bond, it also issued an enormous stormwater, separation and cleanup bond, and did a lot of work. It's still happening in Burlington, but it's not as bad as it used to be.
Yeah, no, we really did. It's a symbol of our crumbling bridges and roads, and this is a terrible problem that needs to be solved, and we need to make those investments, and we're not making them, and we weren't making them before, and it hasn't gotten enough attention. I think it's because it's such a big problem. People avoid it, and it's not just Vermont. I mean, like if you go to a big city, there are these giant hydrants, basically, right? That during these, like in New York City, you could go to the along the Hudson River on the west side. There are these giant hydrants, basically, that basically when there's an overflow event, we'll have a mix of wastewater and stormwater because they can't overwhelm the plant, and that gets discharged right into the Hudson River. So, I mean, it's not just a Vermont problem. Doesn't make it right, but it's a huge problem.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I've seen it a lot in, publicized, but I have not been able to compare. There's always that big question: how does this compare with other pollution that we're spending all this money and effort for decades cleaning up Lake Champlain? Is this one problem overwhelming everything else? And it sounds like it's really not.
No, I mean, the science is that it's not contributing to the phosphorus, but it is, certainly you don't want to be in these waters when that's occurring, right? And it certainly can contribute to beach closures, right? It could be, I think that's part of the reason for there's a big event and it's bacteria and then it remains, but then it does dissipate, So the impacts are not sort of the long-term impacts that phosphorus is, but it shouldn't be happening, and it's a symbol of the failure of our country to seriously deal with our infrastructure.
Yep. Well, Rob has a question.
Yeah, so it's a follow-up to what Lyn was talking about, being cuts from DEC's water testing project. But it reminded me of the lead up to us trying to get water funding, and then how the actually current administration was really uncooperative in forming that in the start. They were basically ignoring us, our request, but there were some people within the Agency of Natural Resources who are cooperative, who are really committed to doing this type of work. How is the current Agency of Natural Resources or Department of Environmental Conservation handling this kind of financial crush? Like, do they want to see this continued, or is it kind of still they're being tied because of further pressure up from maybe the governor? So John or Lyn?
Lyn, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that, I mean, for us, the staff at DEC and ANR are amazing partners. I think they all want to do the right thing in terms of, funding this important work. Whether structural and other things get in the way of that always happening is a different question. But I think at the, the staff intention level, and again, like we are, we need to look ahead because there's a lot of funding that is happening to support, again, riparian buffer planting, stormwater management, that's happening at the state, and they've been committed partners to making that work happen. But I think we all need to keep our eye, as Jon was saying, on decisions that are made around what we're going to move forward with in terms of funding and funding potential cuts with COVID. So I haven't mentioned, but another thing I just feel like I should mention to folks is just keeping, because I think something that people aren't really aware of is that the Vermont license plate, the conservation license plate program, when you buy a license plate, that money also it goes towards a grant program that goes into communities. It sometimes goes to watershed groups and conservation districts, but it often goes to even smaller organizations and schools who are doing watershed programs. And that program was also something that was cut this year, so we'll have our eye on that. So I think, what we want to make sure is that I guess maybe it's the idea that, that we're not making these small cuts with the intention that it's going to save money or staff time. So it's, again, I think the staff are committed, but it's making sure that these small cuts don't kind of eat away at community groups and work that's actually happening from getting done. So I think we all need to keep our eye on that as decisions are made this year. And I know, John, you definitely will have your eye on the budget, and we all will as we move forward.
Well, thank you. Maybe that's a good note to close on.
I had a question.
Yes, Rebecca.
I've always been interested in water testing for my home for drinking water. And how do you know I know that what they could test for is like 300 different things or something. How do you discern how comprehensive a test you should get, who should do it, and what it should or could cost? Is there a way of knowing that? And can you recommend anyone in the state who does that?
Yeah, you should. Yeah, I'm not. This is not like my core of expertise. I would call. You can call the state water supply people. Will have, the people who deal with installing wells will have some good advice for you. There's something called Green Mountain Water Testing. You should call the private companies that do this work. You really don't have to test for very much. It's really what you want to test for to protect yourself and your family. It really is sort of the Wild West in terms of installing a well. They basically test for the basic sort of pathogens, and then not other contaminants like toxic chemicals and pesticides and things of that nature. So it really depends on, kind of where you are, where your well is, what the threats might be. And it could get pretty expensive, but I could give Rob the name of some of the groups that kind of work on this issue and the water testing to send to you.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks very much.
I think I agree. The big thing for you is figure out where your water comes from, and to see if the source is free of contamination.
Well, how do you know that? The water company would come out and figure that out?
Yeah, they could test for, they would evaluate are you near a farm? If you're near a farm, it could be pesticides. The geology could determine there's some naturally occurring contaminants, that are in certain bedrock, which you could easily ascertain from the geologic maps we have. So the experts will be able to kind of size up what the risks are and then recommend what to test for.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for a great evening of water talk.
Great. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Great night. So with that, we close and we'll be here next week.